Hello, I'm Dr. Amaleya Goneos-Malka. Welcome to Womanity-Women in Unity, the show that celebrates women's milestone achievements in their struggle for liberation, self-emancipation, human rights, democracy, and much more. Joining us today for our series on women in the judiciary is Judge Kate Savage, who is currently a judge of the Western Cape High Court. She is also a judge of the Labour Appeal Court and serves as acting Deputy Judge President of both the Labour Courts and the Labour Appeal Court. Welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, and thanks for having me.
I'd like to open today's program with a quote from Rose Bird, who was Chief Justice of the California Supreme Court, and she stated, "The judiciary must not take on the coloration of whatever may be popular at the moment. We are guardians of rights, and we have to tell people things they often do not like to hear." Close quote, which I interpret as the meaning of doing the right thing always.
That's right.
Judge Savage, before your appointment to the bench, you had more than 25 years' experience in the legal field as an attorney involved with litigation, arbitration. You've also worked with the Legal Resources Center's Constitutional Litigation Unit, the Commission for Conciliation, Mediation and Arbitration, otherwise known as the CCMA, various commercial law firms, as well as the ANC's Constitutional Commission during the drafting of the final South African Constitution. Academically, you hold a BA, a Bachelor of Law, and Master of Laws degrees. Each step in your career has successively built upon the previous one. To begin with, can you please tell us what sparked your interest to pursue law?
Well, I grew up in a family, in a white South African family, which was actively opposed to apartheid. And from a young age, I was made aware of apartheid's horrors and how people were degraded so desperately in apartheid, and was moved in a sense first by my family to act in my life to change our society. We used to sit around the dinner table having conversations about what it meant to be a white South African and what the consequences of that were for our life. My parents were both politically active and were involved in careers that were politically active, and so it was easy to have these conversations. And the conversations also expanded into other world issues and human rights and social justice and such topics. So I initially wanted to study African history, which I did initially do at university, and then was accepted into history honors at UCT. But my father, who was an academic and a sociologist, was extremely fierce in his view that he felt that I should study law. And he thought that was a far more useful endeavor than engaging in an academic career. So I battled myself through the next couple of years to decide whether that's what I really should do or not, and finally decided to enroll for law at UCT and started my relationship with the law from that point onwards. I can't say I was the best law student because I was very politically active at university, but it certainly, in those subjects that interested me, I put some effort, and in others that didn't, I can't say I put a lot. But I got through my law degree with a lot of my mother's help, to be honest, because at the end of every year, I'd say to her, "Look, I can't stand this. I'm going back to history." And she'd say, "Oh, for heaven's sake, please continue on and just get it done, and you can go back to your history." And of course, that's how I got through it.
When you were speaking about being politically active at university, I think for me, this is one of the points that are really interesting, that when you're at university, isn't just about getting your qualification. It's about the journey. It's about being shaped by the environment and actively participating in life.
Absolutely. It's such an incredible opportunity at that time of one's life. Having very strongly held beliefs, to explore those beliefs and to be engaging with people from different backgrounds and different views about our society and what it should look like going into the future. And I think I grasped both of those, the bull by the horns, as it was, and I basically engaged with university full on in all of its facets. I was involved in politics. I was involved in political organizations. I was involved in non-racial sport organizations. I took stances on things. I spent time on campus. Those were the 80s. We were protesting. We were trying to change the country.
And you did. And I think that for me is also one of the most powerful things about being involved in a profession like yours, where you can make meaningful change that impacts on not just lives in the moment, but lives down the line in the future.
That's right. I think we can.
Can you tell us about some of the highlights in your journey from attorney to judge, especially how it feels to have been part of driving and drafting the final South African Constitution?
Well, when I look back at my life, I can hardly believe that one step followed in the way that it did. And sometimes apparently so neatly, when I was faced at the time with a feeling of chaos and sometimes trauma. I mean, it took difficult decisions to move away from particular jobs and into other jobs. And it was a difficult choice. And it wasn't always one that came easily or naturally or seemed like the logical thing to do. So in some senses, it's kind of a lucky trajectory that I sometimes think got me there. When my 3 children came along and were born, I was self-employed. And so I didn't get one day's worth of paid maternity leave. And I simply started working again at a pace that I could manage. And as an attorney, as my practice grew and I became more and more senior, as it were, I battled to try and balance being a mother and being an attorney, and a litigating attorney at that. So tried to walk out of the law firm in the middle of the afternoon to get back to my children so that I was able to input meaningfully into their lives and into their growth and development as human beings. So as part of all of this, back to the constitutional negotiation process, I mean, it was also felt like an incredible stroke of luck that I was suddenly involved through people I'd known really while I was on campus, and in my involvement in sort of community politics. I was contacted and asked if I'd consider applying for the job as a researcher in the ANC's Constitutional Commission. And I did that, and I really was centrally involved in all the negotiations, in the internal negotiations within the ANC, in the negotiations between the ANC and the other political parties, and setting the agendas for those meetings, and also in the drafting of important clauses when we got down to the last 3, which were the education, the labor, and the land clause. I was very involved in helping to finalize those clauses. But perhaps the one that stands out for me the most was the last minute involvement in the preamble, which I had not been involved in previously, and in which Cyril Ramaphosa suddenly said to me, "Kate, you better go off and let's get a draft preamble done." And off I trundled and tried to put together a preamble, and it's now feels somewhat incredible to write judgments which sometimes refer to words that I know that I wrote.
You really have been part of South Africa's history and its future. Amazing feeling.
Yeah, very, very strange sometimes, yeah.
Staying with the kind of publishing gambit, I know that you've written several publications, and I'll just list a couple of titles, one being Negotiating South Africa's New Constitution, a chapter in a post-apartheid constitutions with perspectives on South Africa's basic law, and another was on a compensation scheme for victims of crime in South Africa. Can you share a few of the key points that emanated from these publications?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps the starting point is I don't consider myself a terrific academic and author, I must admit. Whilst I enjoy writing and I find it sometimes easy to write, I don't always rate my own writing. So I suffer from a lot of perhaps that feeling that one just doesn't have what it takes to be an incredible author. Nevertheless, when I have written what I've been actively involved in, I find I write in a sort of very practical way, and which is perhaps reflective of my personality. I was involved in research into a compensation scheme for victims of crime, and something which, in my view, could still be explored. It certainly was being explored by the Law Commission at that stage. And with other people, we wrote a draft as to what that would look like, something in the way of a road accident fund, which would be funded through a tax, whether on alcohol or firearms. I can't remember how we proposed it, even if that such an additional tax was to be unpopular. And then also I wrote up my experiences of the drafting process during the constitutional negotiations. And that I was lucky enough to do during the course of my LLM in America. And that was, of course, for me, very useful to put down on paper what I've just been involved in doing. So those really have been sort of perhaps what I've been most involved in.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you is that as a judge, interpreting the law means you have to make tough decisions. Someone's going to be happy, someone's not going to be happy. Can you share with us, say, a couple of the most memorable cases that you've presided over?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps to start, it's a lonely job being a judge. So one expresses a view and you then stay quiet in the face of both criticism and support for your view. And sometimes your view needs to be a brave one, which you may not agree with the prevailing view on a bench when you're sitting with two other judges or even with four other judges. You have to stand true to who and remain true to who you are. You have to stand with your view and at other times, of course, you need to shift your views when you're sitting in courts with a number of judges and be open to being persuaded that you might be wrong. So it's not an easy process. Certainly, some of the cases that I've been involved in, for instance, are the Prime Media case involving signal blocking in 2014 at the opening of Parliament, and also on the filming of behaviour in Parliament at that time. And that case, I differed from my two colleagues. So I wrote a dissenting judgment, and my dissent was ultimately upheld in the Supreme Court of Appeal. So that was one of my judgments that I felt that I took a stance. I stood by it. I was not prepared to shift my position, and I ultimately was upheld on it. Another case which I'd been involved in was in the Labour Appeal Court was one on derivative misconduct, another one where I wrote a dissenting opinion, and which went to the Constitutional Court and was upheld. So that was on essentially holding individuals to account where they were striking, but couldn't particularly say what had occurred during the course of a strike. And I expressed my views on that. And perhaps, I mean, one of the issues that really led me to the position that I took on that was that I took cognizance of the fact that a woman living in a township on her own, perhaps with her children, working for a large company such as in this case Dunlop, might have been on strike but have known nothing of what was going on, and to simply call her to account for what had occurred just couldn't happen. It didn't seem to be fair. And the Constitutional Court agreed with me. My colleagues, we had long debates about the matter, and my colleagues weren't persuaded by my view. And that obviously one feels in a sense vindicated when one's upheld, but equally one takes stances and one's not upheld. I recently wrote a judgment in the Labour Appeal Court in which the Constitutional Court differed from me. And that too, one has to stand by one's view. That was a view I expressed, and the law benefits from different views. You don't always get it right, but I think sometimes your view may be premature in the sense that the law is still getting there. In other senses, the majority view is not yours, and you might take a position that's not the same as the majority of other judges, and that's just how it goes. I've been involved in other cases, such as those involve a case in the Labour Appeal Court on sexual harassment and making it clear what was permissible conduct as far as sexual harassment was concerned, and also been involved in other cases, criminal cases and so on, which one would have read about in the media. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing some of those insights and cases. Reflecting for a moment on what you're saying, I was thinking how it must be to almost walk in your shoes or in a judge's shoes, and thinking about the qualities that you have to adopt. So one of the aspects was standing by your conviction and your opinion, so being very independently minded. And the other point that you mentioned was that it can be a lonely route because you have to uphold your beliefs, you have to stand firm, but at the same time, you also have to be open and receptive to other opinions. Can you perhaps just give us a little bit more in terms of some of the values that you think a judge should possess?
I think it's not everybody's cut out for it, I must say. I think it is such a lonely job that for some people, it's the kind of job that, in fact, does not appeal. And I am innately quite a private person and don't really love the limelight. So for me, I found it difficult sometimes to see my name in the newspaper or in lights. I don't really choose that in my life. And so that's been the more difficult part of me, whereas for some of my colleagues, that's the easiest part. So in a way, to say that there are trays that's sort of cross-cut all judges is somewhat difficult. But I think some of the general ones are that one really does need to be able to take a view on something and to be able to express why you do so and then stand by that. And in some circumstances, even in the face of opposition or a public view that it's the wrong position or it's the wrong decision. For instance, you might impose a criminal sentence on someone and a general view publicly is that that's too lenient a sentence, that in the circumstances of the matter, a more severe sentence was warranted. And those sorts of things do happen. And judges need to just take they need to take the good with the bad, the criticism with the support, and read of what they've said and how it's analyzed as it comes. So you have to be, in a sense, quite brave, independently minded, and able to stand your ground, but at the same time, be confident enough with yourself and your opinions, I think, to not be too moved when there is perhaps a negative response to the stances that you hold.
Staying with the career aspect for a moment, in 2022, you were elected by the United Nations General Assembly as a judge of the United Nations Appeal Tribunal. Can you tell us what that role entails, what it means, and also how it came about?
Yes, I mean, we're in an era now where there are increasing numbers of female judges, but this hasn't always been so. I mean, I think I was something like the 13th judge appointed to the Western Cape, female judge appointed to the Western Cape High Court. And I think fewer than 3 or 4 or 5 women have been appointed to the Labour Appeal Court. So in the international arena, the situation's somewhat similar. Some countries, of course, are better than others. So in relation to the United Nations position, I was asked by a friend who lives and works internationally, a South African friend, to consider applying for international arbitration and other adjudication positions, given her work in advancing women and the numbers of women in the international judicial sector. And I fortuitously simply opened up a page online on the United Nations, and this position had been advertised, and it was advertised for a small window. So when that occurred, it sort of seemed to me this was most peculiar, because it was the first time I'd looked at anything of the sort, and it seemed to pop up. And I ended up applying for it and thought I had no chance whatsoever. I had to write a 3-hour exam, had to go through an interview, and then, of course, it had to go to the General Assembly, and I was then elected to the 7-member United Nations Appeals Tribunal. And what the tribunal is it's part of the United Nations' own internal justice system, because it is a system which runs across so many different national jurisdictions. It's impossible for the UN to be litigating in different countries, and so particularly in the area of employment and in other allied fields, pension fund and some other limited areas. The UN Appeals Tribunal would be essentially a labour appeal court for the UN system. So there's a labour court, which would be the United Nations Dispute Tribunal, and that hears a whole lot of cases involving the bulk of cases are employment-related cases in the United Nations system, and then those cases come on appeal to the United Nations Appeals Tribunal. Yeah.
Hmm. I don't know where you have the time to fit that into your schedule.
Well, if you structure your life properly and carefully, one can always find time. So
We can always
it is
take
difficult to
lessons
keep
from
writing.
But seriously,
Yeah.
honestly, how do you do that? How do you manage? Because the next question I'm going to ask you about is some of the board membership roles that you sit on. So as a practical tool, what do you do to help structure so that you can participate as actively as you do in all of these forums?
I mean, one of the things I've had to learn is not to try and be a perfectionist when I'm writing judgments. I try to get judgments out fairly fast and to write down essentially what the key facts are and what the law is and what I think the conclusion should be to the judgment, with reasons provided, of course. But if one's going to spend one's time trying to make the product absolutely perfect, it would take a lot longer. In our system, we have very little legal research support. We don't get briefing notes. We don't get anything of the sort. And that does add a lot of pressure onto judges, especially in the courts below the Constitutional Court. And it does mean that that one has to quite quickly, after a hearing, get down to writing a judgment. Otherwise, it sits there for some time, and one has to, in a sense, get back into the merits of the matter. So I try and get my judgments out quite quickly, and that's what, and to not be a perfectionist in the way that I approach them. And then as far as the writing is concerned and the research is concerned, I just try and fit that in. So sometimes one will have a number of projects on the go, as it were, number of judgments that are all in a part written state.
Yeah. So it's about speed, it's about efficiency, and if I can say, it's almost about having freshness of doing things when they're top of mind, because then you're more focused and centered on the topic.
I mean, I think that those of my colleagues who battle with their writing skills have a significant difficulty because there's so much writing in law and in judging, so that the ability to write fluidly and fluently is just invaluable. And I think that if I was to say to a student, who might one day end up as a judge, I'd say, really writing and language skills become more and more important, not less and less. Yeah.
Oh, so true. And I think communication in every sphere is
Yes.
vital.
Yes, absolutely.
So, as I'd mentioned, I was going to ask you about some of the other memberships that you're part of. You're a board member of the Southern African Legal Information Institute, a member of the South African Society for Labour Law. You also served previously as trustee for the Constitutional Court Trust up until 2019 and others. One of the things that we found in our conversations across the board is that professional networking is a really important element for career development, but yet it seems to be an area of weakness for some women. Based on your experiences, how do you think women can become more effective at building and nurturing their professional networks?
I suppose it might be easier nowadays because there's more of an emphasis on social media. I'm not very good on social media. In fact, I consider myself something of a liability. So and in fact, I don't really like it either. I'm just not, I wasn't, in a sense, schooled into that way of communicating, and so find it difficult to do that, and find that the public nature of it quite concerning to me. But I think professional networking in current times is a little bit easier potentially, in that one can join LinkedIn and one can make connections with people and keep connected with people you're at university with or you've worked with at various times in your career. But I suppose what I have done is followed my areas of interest, and I have always tried to work hard, to be reliable, I've placed enormous store on collegiality, and I've tried to build relationships with people around me as I work. And I don't join organizations or try and get into professional positions just for the sake of doing that. I do it nor do I do it because there'll be some professional benefit necessarily for me. I've done it because it's something I wanted to do, that I felt was useful to do, and I wanted to put my time into it. So, for instance, in relation to the Constitutional Court Trust, I had for a long time been involved with the Constitutional Court Trust, which had been established to essentially oversee the development of the Constitutional Court's library, to get its clerkships programs going, and other such projects. Its artworks project fell under the trust. trust, and all of those various different aspects I was involved in. And then when I was a trustee of the trust, we were also by that stage involved in judgment reporting online. And I'm very, very passionate about online access to judgments because I believe it's so essential, not only for the rule of law, but also for judicial accountability reasons. We need to ensure that members of the public have access to judgments, that they're not kept in some dark hallways where it's difficult to go and find them. Now we've got online, the Southern African Legal Information Institute. You can go there for free. You can download whatever judgments you want. And we started with nothing. We started off really at a very base level. And now we've got thousands and thousands of judgments. And it's a very well used site that has added, I believe, enormous value to the legal community. And I hope will continue to do so. We're currently in the business of trying to get law statutes online, which has posed something of a difficulty, but we're trying to pick them up out of Parliament and get them straight online onto SAFLI and then be able to update them, which will just also be such an invaluable resource to people and to students as well, practitioners and others. So I've really got involved in organizations which marry with my interests and my beliefs. And in those organizations, I've then developed networks with people who I have found helpful, who've been able to give me guidance in my career, I've been able to bounce things off and decide on my future trajectory from those meetings. Mm-hmm. So that's really how I've gone about it. Yeah.
It sounds really reciprocal, and almost you're investing into the organizations, you're investing into the people, and in turn receiving benefits by way of fulfilling some of your needs. So it's kind of like what you put in is also what you get out.
I think that's right. I think that you develop relations. I've once spoken to young women lawyers and said, you can't just choose a mentor and say, oh, hi, I want you to be my mentor. I don't think that's a very useful way. And I also don't think it's very useful to necessarily only have one mentor. Mentors should be people that you meet along the way, who are able to give you guidance. They might even be in your family. They might be not in law if you're not in law. They might be in other area, if you're in law, they might be in other areas. And so to seek out people who are able to give you, who you're able to use as a sounding board, I think is the most useful thing to do in terms of trying to build your career and its development.
Yeah. And enduring relationships, that's the other element that I've picked up. It's, as we're working on specific projects, you formulate relationships, you've got the collegiality, and you just keep building out on those networks and feeding them.
Absolutely. I agree with you.
Judge Savage, we are approaching the month of August, which in South Africa is a period where we celebrate Women's Month, and we simultaneously reflect on the gains, but also on the challenges that still need to be overcome. For International Women's Day, which was the 8th of March, the theme was Invest in Women, Accelerate Progress. As a judge, seeing people's rights upheld and also infringed upon, how do you interpret this theme?
Well, I think that we've got so much to do in terms of our society and enabling women in our society. And one of the starting points to that is that we have enormous numbers in law of female law graduates who come out of law. I think the law school numbers are more women graduate nowadays than men. But we don't see those women coming to the top of the legal profession either very quickly or easily. And I think we've got a long way to go in terms of trying to enable people to engage properly with their careers. I get concerned when women do law or study law for reasons that it looks good on my CV, that I might but they have no intention of engaging in a professional world in which they might use their legal knowledge. That seems to me a little bit worrying and
wasteful,
unfortunate. And certainly from our country's perspective, I'd rather see us then having women come into law who really want to be in law. So I think that one of the things is we're getting the numbers of graduates out of law school, but we accelerate the progress of women, particularly in the law. And I think it really does span other areas of endeavor in our society by ensuring that women are placed in a position where they can properly engage with their careers. And for me, one of the things that strikes me from the outset is the relationship between women and mothering, is that very, very often we have so little in the way of proper supports for women who are in a position where they're running essentially a household, or they have children and they're trying to manage children and they're trying to manage a career. We also have a situation where we have very poor preschool facilities, or at least not equal quality preschool facilities of equal quality for people, for children across all communities. So we've got some women coming into law who simply who had not had the advantage from the age of 2 or 3 of a proper early education, and have come into school and have had to be constantly on the catch up from the point that they came into grade 1. So one of my great motivating, and perhaps one of the areas that I believe we need to work on most, for all South Africans, and not just women, and all, not just South Africans, everybody, is trying to ensure that all children have access to a proper education from the earliest point possible, and that provides a sort of level playing ground from which we can all move. But in relation to advancing women's careers, the importance of being able to have children in a proper preschool situation is that it allows all women to say, well, I'm leaving my child at this preschool being properly cared for, and I'm able properly to engage with my career. So that's one of the things that I think we continually need to do. Of course, we need to enable women to live freely and work to their best potential. But one of the best ways of doing that is to make sure that women are able to really do so from the perspective of mothering. I also think safety is a starting point. I mean, in the courts, we see horrific amounts of crime against women. Gender-based violence is constantly a theme. It's constantly and correctly a theme of politicians. We talk about gender-based violence at home, in public, in the workplace. And we have all of the right, we say all of the right things, but it doesn't seem to translate.
Yeah. One of the things that I've noted in our conversation and the actions that you've taken in your career is that you've been very pragmatic about doing things and seeing them come into being or fruition. Talking about gender-based violence and the experiences and the elements that you must have been exposed to in the courts, what do you think we can do realistically to help stem it or stop it completely?
You know, one sits in criminal courts, and it's a question I sit there and ask myself while I'm listening to the most horrific details for hour after hour. Details that I never share with my family because I feel it will infect those around me. And I don't want that to happen. I grapple with how we will resolve it, but I think what we ultimately need is we need a more egalitarian society. We need to ensure that we have the levels of poverty are reduced. We need to ensure that women are living in safe environments. We need to ensure that children are safe. We need to ensure that everybody has access to the similar amounts of food, of access to resources, access to water, access to safety, etc. I mean, we really need to start right at the beginning and start with our building blocks. I can't see any other way. There's going to be no quick fix until we've really dealt with deep levels and deeply rooted levels of inequality and poverty in the society, I believe. Of course, in the home, we can run more progressive and perhaps we can run media campaigns around gender-based violence in the home. We have domestic protection orders now easily accessible and so on. But one does ask how much that will change if we're not changing male views towards women in the home, in the workplace. We're not changing people's views of the role of women and so on. So we can run more, and there probably is some good in doing it. public information campaigns and really ensuring that the message is brought home. But I'm not sure that alone that it will achieve it. We really have to solve the deep-rooted problems in our societies in order to actually resolve gender-based violence finally.
Well, one can only hope that things will move forwards and that there are ways that we can get to achieving a more egalitarian state and having equal access to resources. Because I think you're right, that is part of the challenge, that being denied access or not having access to something, that there is the inferiority, then there's the power complex, and people take it out on people that they shouldn't be taking it out on.
Yes, absolutely, without a doubt. Yes.
Judge Savage, we're coming to the end of the show, and one question that I wanted to ask you, it's a question we ask all our guests, is about some of the factors that they feel have contributed towards their success. So if you could share some of the elements that you think have helped you get to where you are.
Well, it's very difficult. I mean, I suppose it starts with my family. I mean, my mother, my father, my grandparents, my paternal grandmother, my closest friends. I mean, they have been enormous source of support to me, ongoing support. My husband is a gentle man who's been a pillar of support for me. He's a reminder that it does make a difference who you choose to have as your partner and who you choose to have around you. I think that some of the challenges I've faced in my life have led me to where I am. I have not had always an easy time. I've sometimes had some grave areas of difficulty. I have 2 children with a bleeding disorder known as hemophilia. My brother is a hemophiliac, and that has posed its own problems. I've had a son who's not only a hemophiliac, but had a brain tumor, and that was perhaps one of the most difficult experiences of my life. So there have been challenges, and I think we have, all of us, challenges. Everybody has a tapestry that makes their life unique. And those challenges, in fact, are often very growing and, although difficult, make one into who one really should and is ultimately and should be. My take on it is that I think the more different experiences one has, the more nuanced a human being you are. In fact, difficulties are often very useful and very growing. My father was once on sabbatical in the US, and I was there as a 16-year-old high school student, and I went to a large working class inner city school in the US in which 4% of the students were white. And I was exposed to kids taking drugs at school and teenage pregnancies and all sorts of things that I certainly hadn't been exposed to at a government school in Cape Town, and therefore found it an enormously interesting experience, although very, very difficult. It challenged me to my core. So some of these difficult experiences, in fact, add to who one is and make one open to different experiences and enable one to understand people differently. And I think lead one to decide, well, what kind of person do I actually want to be? Who is it that I, as a person, want to be at the end of the day? Do I want to be remembered as a judge and all these important things that I do as a judge? And they are important for society. But I'm not sure I really want to be remembered as that, because I know that the day you walk out of your office and close the door, someone else walks in, and someone walks in younger with a more modern approach to things, with new ideas which are refreshing and new and are more in line with current thinking and so on. So what is it that you think you'd like to be, and to who is it you would ultimately like to be? And I mean, I think what I've really tried to work on as a human being is to say, well, I'd like to be remembered primarily by my friends and family as a loyal and generous and a kind, loving, fearless mother, good daughter, wife who's the best she can be, sister, friend, and so on. And I think I would like to be remembered as those things before necessarily my professional being. Although, of course, my professional being has been and the areas of work in which I've been involved, I feel quite privileged to really have been involved in them. And I hope that I can continue to be involved in all of these different areas of work. But in doing that, I want to make sure that I always keep my feet firmly on the ground. I have a very dear judge friend who very sadly was killed he was bitten by a black mamba and died in a most tragic and freak accident. And he always used to laugh at himself when he says that one day his car was in the garage and it was not getting the attention it deserved. So he phoned the garage up and he said to the guy, "Could I speak to the manager?" And he said, "Yes, sure." And he got put through. And the manager said, "Hi, X speaking." And he said, "Who am I speaking to?" And he said, "Judge X." And the manager's immediate response was, "What's the first name?" And I think that for me is what I hold on to that story. It's important that you remember your first name as a judge. You need to remember who you are. Don't let anything get to your head. I'm just as good and just as flawed and just as sensitive and just as difficult as anyone else. And so that's who I am. And warts and all, I hope that what I bring to the judiciary is an ability to appreciate people from different backgrounds, to understand where they've come from, to encourage people to overlook their own insecurities and difficulties in their own lives and really try and strive to get to the best place they can get to.
Wow. Thank you for sharing insights into your life and also the way of touching other people. And I think for me, my core takeouts today have been about an emphasis on human values, on true values, on knowing who you are. And you've given us a refreshing perspective on challenges and difficulties as treating those obstacles as opportunities for growth. So thank you so much for joining us today. It's been wonderful to host you.
Oh, great. Thank you. It's been a wonderful opportunity to talk to you. So I hope somebody can find something they can take out of my experience thus far.
And happy Women's Day.
Yes, and to you. Thank you very much.
You have been listening to Womanity-Women in Unity, and today we have been talking to Judge Kate Savage, who is currently a judge of the Western Cape High Court, also a judge of the Labour Appeal Court, and serves as acting Deputy Judge President of Labour Courts and the Labour Appeal Court.